Today I'm going to talk about type 2 hypersensitivity reaction. And as you may know, it is due to reactivity of antibodies against membrane-bound antigens. It means that the antigen, it is bound to the membrane, and the antibody, it binds that antigen. That is to say, the antigens are not circulating or free antigens. In contrast, and this is in contrast to hypersensitivity reaction type 3, where the antibody and the antigen, they are free and they have the capacity to circulate and reside. Examples of hypersensitivity type 2 are rheumatic heart disease, and as you know that the antibodies against streptococci, they get bound or they bind to membrane-bound antigen on the surface of the heart, and this is due to similarity in some sequences on the wall of the streptococci and on the wall of the heart, and this we call it molecular mimicry or cross reactivity. Example number 2 is Mycenae Gravis, and as you know that if this is the muscle, so the motor end plate, it looks like this, and then the acetylcholine, it comes from the vesicles on the motor end plate, and this acetylcholine will bind to acetylcholine receptors. However, in some instances, or the individual may upregulate antibodies against the acetylcholine receptors. They sit here and they interfere with the acetylcholine, and they may lead to temporal paralysis. A third example is Graves disease, and as you know that thyroid stimulating hormone, they have receptors on the thyrocytes. So when they bind the receptor, this gives signal to produce thyroxine. However, in Graves disease, the patient mount antibodies, and these antibodies, they are similar to TSH, and they sit on the receptors. So this will lead to overproduction of thyroxine and Graves disease. Also, some types of transplant rejection, when the antibodies, when the recipient, there is preformed antibodies, already made antibodies. So these antibodies will bind to antigen in the transplanted organ from the donor, and this may lead to rapid activation of the classical pathway of the complement, and may lead to hyperacute rejection or rejection of the transplanted organ in table or on table. And also other example for hypersensitive reaction type 2 is immune thrombocytopenia, where antibodies are raised against the platelets, for example, following viral infection or following vaccination with MMR, or in some autoimmune disorders, for example, SLE and rheumatoid arthritis. Also, one example of hypersensitive reaction type 2 is acute hemolytic transfusion reaction, and this occurs when the blood or transfused blood is incompatible, and usually the donor red blood cells, like in here, they are distracted by preformed antibodies in the recipients, and binding of antibodies to some antigens on the surface of the red blood cells will activate C1, and C1 will bind, and so this C1q, and this will lead to formation of membrane attack complex. Also, type 2 hypersensitivity reaction may take place in good posture syndrome, where an individual may mount antibodies against the collagen, and these antibodies, they interact with the basement membrane of the glomeruli and lead to destruction. So this allow larger molecules to pass. Thank you very much, Professor Ahmed Boulad.